Spring 1941. In Kyiv, the cherry trees were blooming early that year. The streets were filled with laughter, music, and the noise of trams rattling across cobblestones. Students filled the cafes, debating philosophy and history, arguing over poetry and politics. Among them was a young woman, Lyudmila Pavlichenko. At 24, she was everything a university student was supposed to be: bright, confident, and full of plans. She studied history at Kyiv University and dreamed of one day becoming a scholar, perhaps a teacher. Her notebooks were filled with notes on medieval battles, not because she loved war, but because she admired strategy, endurance, and courage. She could recite the campaigns of Alexander the Great or the sieges of ancient cities, but she never imagined she would one day live through one. She spent her evenings skating along the frozen Dnieper River in winter, walking under the linden trees in spring, and reading poetry on park benches. Her world was books, not battlefields. But across the western border of the Soviet Union, another world was moving. In Germany, trains carried tanks eastward under the cover of night. Millions of soldiers waited. The invasion plan had been signed. Its name, Operation Barbarossa. When the news reached Kyiv that the Germans had crossed the border, the world Lyudmila knew vanished in a single breath. Posters appeared overnight, the motherland calls, summoning every able-bodied citizen to defend their land. Trains full of volunteers left the city daily. Women were expected to nurse, sew, or work in factories. But Lyudmila didn't want to patch uniforms or roll bandages. She wanted to fight. She walked to the local enlistment office wearing her student coat and carrying her identification papers. The recruiting sergeant barely looked up when she approached. "You're here to volunteer." "Yes. I want to join the infantry." He smirked as if she'd told a joke. "Girls don't go to the front. We need nurses, typists. Maybe you can help the wounded." Lyudmila's voice was calm, steady. "I don't want to help the wounded. I want to stop them from being wounded." The sergeant laughed, not cruelly, just dismissively, as men often did in those days. Then she reached into her bag and placed something on his desk, a small leather case holding her marksmanship certificates. She had been shooting since she was 14. She joined a civilian marksmanship club for fun, outshooting nearly every boy her age. She D1 medals, trophies, and national competitions. The sergeant's expression changed. He sent her to the training range behind the building. A grizzled officer handed her a Mosin Nagant rifle, long, heavy, with a cold wooden stock. "Let's see if the student can shoot." She lay prone, exhaled, and fired. The first shot hit the target center. So did the second. And the third. The officer lowered his binoculars, stunned. "All right, comrade. Welcome to the 25th Rifle Division." That moment changed history. Lyudmila's training was short, brutal, and efficient. The Red Army didn't have time for long courses. The front was collapsing, and the Germans were advancing fast. She was issued a uniform 2 sizes too large, a rifle with a cracked stock, and a pair of boots meant for a man twice her size. Still, she wore them proudly. Her mother wept when she left home. Her father, a factory worker and veteran of the First World War, saluted her silently. Before dawn the next morning, she boarded a train heading south to Odessa on the Black Sea. Odessa was under siege. The Axis had surrounded the city from 3 sides, their artillery pounding it day and night. The sea was the only escape route. When Lyudmila arrived, she was assigned to a sniper platoon, a small, elite unit trained to operate between enemy lines. Her rifle was a bolt-action Mosin Nagant with a simple 3.5x scope, nothing fancy, but deadly in the right hands. At first, her male comrades didn't take her seriously. They joked about the girl with the rifle. Some even made bets on how long she'd last. Then, during her first mission, a German scout crawled within 300 meters of their position. She spotted him through the scope and took a single shot. The man fell without a sound. Later that day, she took another and another. By evening, 3 German soldiers lay motionless across the field. When she returned to camp, the jokes stopped. Over the next few weeks, Lyudmila proved herself again and again. She moved silently through the rubble, camouflaged in earth and ash, lying motionless for hours, her eyes scanning every movement in the distance. She learned to tell friend from foe by the smallest detail, the angle of a helmet, the flash of binocular glass, the rhythm of a stride. Patience became her weapon. Sometimes she waited 10 hours for a single target. Sometimes she went days without firing a shot. Her commander said she had the nerves of a surgeon and the eyes of a hawk. By the end of her first month, her count had reached 100 confirmed kills. Within 2, it was 187. Word spread quickly through the Soviet ranks. Soldiers began to whisper her name in the trenches, Pavlichenko, the sniper. To the Germans, she became a ghost, unseen, silent, and deadly. Radio intercepts recorded German officers warning their troops. Beware the Russian woman with the rifle. But Lyudmila wasn't fighting for fame. Each shot for her was personal, not vengeance, but necessity. She later said in an interview, "Every soldier I stopped was one less invading my home." Life on the front was merciless. Snipers often operated alone or in pairs, hidden among corpses or debris, forced to stay still through rain, snow, and explosions. Lyudmila endured insect bites, hunger, exhaustion, and frostbite, but never wavered. She carried her rifle, 60 rounds of ammunition, a trench knife, and a photograph of her mother in her breast pocket. Her hands were cracked and bruised, her eyes red from hours behind the scope. But the sight of advancing German troops always steadied her. In one battle outside Odessa, her unit was surrounded for 48 hours. They fought without food, water, or sleep. When reinforcements finally arrived, Lyudmila was found in the ruins of a destroyed farmhouse, still alive, her rifle hot from use. By the time Odessa fell in October 1941, Lyudmila had 187 confirmed kills. She was promoted to senior sergeant and reassigned to Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula, the last Soviet stronghold in the south. There, she would face her greatest trial. The road to Sevastopol was a journey into hell. The city was already under siege when she arrived, cut off by land, bombarded by sea and air. Every building was a fortress, every street a trench. German bombers roared overhead in endless waves, dropping fire and steel. The earth itself trembled. The wounded filled basements and tunnels. Supplies ran low. The soldiers slept where they fell between craters, in cellars, in shattered trams. Lyudmila joined the 54th Rifle Regiment. Her task: hunt enemy officers, artillery spotters, and snipers. Sniper duels became deadly games of patience. She learned to recognize a sniper's decoy helmet, to spot the glint of glass in the distance, to wait until her enemy's breathing betrayed him. Each duel could last days. She would crawl through mud, camouflage herself in grass or broken stone, and remain motionless until the slightest movement revealed her opponent. Then she would shoot once and move before the Germans could triangulate her position. The Germans began broadcasting taunts over loudspeakers. "Pavlichenko, come over to our side. We will make you a German officer. We will give you chocolate." She didn't answer, not with words. One morning, the German loudspeaker went silent. Her comrades found the operator dead, a single bullet through the throat. In Sevastopol, Lyudmila became something more than a sniper. She became a legend. The soldiers called her Mila. They said she brought good luck to any unit she joined. She laughed at that, but secretly she carried the hope that maybe it was true. She developed close friendships with her comrades, especially her spotter, Leonid Kutsenko. They shared rations, stories, and moments of silence between the chaos. In the few quiet hours, they would sit on the cliffs overlooking the Black Sea, watching the horizon. Once he asked her what she'd do after the war. She smiled faintly. "Finish my studies. Become a historian. I'd rather read about war than live it." They both laughed. 2 days later, Leonid was killed by a mortar shell. Lyudmila didn't speak for 3 days. Then she returned to her rifle and kept fighting. By early 1942, her kill count surpassed 300. Her reputation spread even beyond the Soviet Union. The press dubbed her Lady Death. But the cost was immense. She was exhausted, wounded twice, and mentally drained. She'd seen friends die, cities burn, and the horizon darken with smoke. Still, she refused to leave. When ordered to rest, she begged to return to the front. Her commanders relented, knowing she was more valuable there than anywhere else. Then, one morning in June 1942, during a fierce bombardment, shrapnel tore through her face and side. Her comrades pulled her from the rubble. She tried to protest, but her voice was gone. This time, she could not return to battle. As she lay recovering on a hospital cot in Sevastopol, she could hear the distant rumble of artillery. Outside, the city was dying, but her legend was being born. Her final confirmed tally before evacuation: 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers. She was 26 years old. Her war on the front was over. But her war for memory, for meaning, had only just begun, June 1942. Sevastopol was burning. The sky was a ceiling of black smoke. German bombers came in endless waves, their engines howling across the sea. The earth itself groaned from the constant impact of shells. Deep beneath the ruins, in a makeshift field hospital, Lyudmila Pavlichenko opened her eyes. Her face was bandaged. The air reeked of iodine and dust. All around her, the wounded moaned in the half-dark. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry and raw. A nurse leaned close. "You're safe, comrade. You're alive." Alive, but she didn't feel it. Her body was shattered. Shrapnel had torn through her jaw and shoulder. Her right arm trembled uncontrollably. The war she had fought so fiercely was still raging outside, and she was trapped on the sidelines, helpless. When the doctors told her she would be evacuated, she protested through cracked lips. "No, I must go back. My regiment is still fighting." The surgeon only shook his head. "You've done enough, Lyudmila Mikhailovna. You've done more than anyone." She turned her face to the wall and wept silently. A few days later, she was loaded onto a transport ship bound for the Caucasus. Sevastopol was collapsing behind her. From the deck, she could see the glow of fires on the horizon. Her city, the fortress she had sworn to defend, was falling. She clenched her fists until her nails cut her palms. The smoke rising from the shore looked like a funeral pyre for everyone she'd known. That night, she wrote a single line in her notebook. "I left my soul in Sevastopol." When the ship reached port, reporters were already waiting. Her reputation had preceded her. In just a year of fighting, this young woman from Kyiv had become a national hero. 309 confirmed kills. Dozens of duels with enemy snipers. Countless soldiers who'd returned from the front swore she'd saved their lives. The newspapers called her Lady Death. Pamphlets carried her image, stern, focused, beautiful in a way that frightened people. The government needed heroes, and Lyudmila was perfect. She was intelligent, articulate, and brave, the living embodiment of defiance. The Soviet Information Bureau began arranging interviews and appearances. But she didn't see herself as a hero. She still saw the faces of her comrades. She still dreamed of the cliffs of Sevastopol and the smell of gunpowder. When journalists asked her how it felt to be famous, she answered softly, "I am only doing my duty." When they asked how she could kill so many men, she said, "Each bullet I fired was aimed at someone who came to kill my people. I have no regrets." In the autumn of 1942, an unusual order arrived. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was to be sent to the United States. The Soviet Union needed allies desperately. The war was going badly, and the Western powers were still hesitating to open a second front in Europe. So Moscow decided to send a human message. Not a general, not a politician, but a young woman who had stared down death 300 times and survived. Lyudmila was reluctant. She didn't want speeches or crowds. But her commanders insisted. "You've done your part with a rifle. Now you will fight with your voice." And so, in September 1942, she boarded a ship bound for America. Across the ocean. The journey took weeks. She spent most of it in silence, staring out at the endless grey sea. Her uniform still bore the stains of mud and blood from Crimea. When she arrived in Halifax, Canada, crowds lined the docks to see her. Cameras flashed. The press swarmed, shouting questions in English she barely understood. When the ship finally docked in Washington, D.C., the United States had never seen anyone like her. A woman soldier. A sniper. A survivor of some of the fiercest battles of the war. She was greeted personally by Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States. Eleanor extended her hand, smiling warmly. "Welcome to America, Lyudmila. We've heard much about your courage." For a moment, the war seemed very far away. Lyudmila stood there, 26 years old, medals gleaming, face still scarred, surrounded by cameras and reporters. But as the journalists began shouting, the strangeness of it all struck her. They weren't asking about the siege or her comrades. They were asking about lipstick. Do you wear makeup at the front? What color nail polish do Soviet women prefer? Do you think your uniform flatters you? She stared at them in disbelief. In Sevastopol, she'd spent nights lying among corpses. Here, they wanted beauty tips. That night, she wrote in her journal, "They ask if I wear powder. I wear dust, the dust of battlefields." Eleanor Roosevelt saw the discomfort on her face. Over dinner at the White House, she said gently, "They don't mean harm, Lyudmila. They've simply never seen a woman like you before." Lyudmila nodded, though she didn't quite believe it. "In my country, we have many women like me. They just don't all come home." The First Lady reached across the table and took her hand. "Then we'll make sure their stories are heard." From that night on, the two became friends. Eleanor accompanied her on a speaking tour across America, from Washington to Chicago, New York to Los Angeles. Everywhere they went, crowds came to see the girl who had killed 309 Germans. But Lyudmila refused to be a spectacle. She was there for one purpose, to demand action. On September 25, 1942, she stood before a crowd of 20,000 people at Chicago's Soldier Field. The wind blew through her uniform as she looked out at the sea of faces. She took a breath and began to speak in clear, careful Russian, her words translated through an interpreter. "I am 25 years old," she said, "and I have killed 309 fascist invaders." The crowd went silent. "Gentlemen, don't you think you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" For a moment, there was nothing, and then thunderous applause. The stadium erupted. People stood, cheering. That line was printed in every newspaper the next day. She had said what few dared to say out loud, that the fight against fascism was a duty for all, not a distant tragedy to watch from safety. Her speech was blunt, unpolished, and real. It was the voice of war itself. American women saw her as a symbol of empowerment. American men saw her as a challenge. And soldiers, young, wide-eyed boys preparing to ship out, lined up to shake her hand. She told them quietly, "Be brave. Be patient. And remember, courage is doing what must be done, even when you are afraid." She toured factories and shipyards, meeting workers who built the planes and tanks that would soon cross the Atlantic. In Detroit, she stood beside women riveting steel hulls, their hands black with oil. "You are soldiers too," she told them. "Every bolt you tighten is another step toward victory." In Los Angeles, Hollywood invited her to appear at a war bond rally. The organizers expected glamour. She arrived in her battle uniform, the same one she'd worn in Odessa, boots scuffed, medals gleaming. The audience fell silent. No stage lights could outshine her scars. By the end of her American tour, Lyudmila had met President Roosevelt, the First Lady, and even Elena's daughter Anna. The Roosevelt family treated her not as propaganda, but as a guest of honor. At Hyde Park, She spent a weekend walking through the gardens, her first real peace in years. Elena later wrote, "Lyudmila had the eyes of someone who has seen too much. Yet she smiled like a child seeing the world for the first time." Their friendship endured for decades. From the United States, Lyudmila traveled to Canada and Great Britain. In London, she met Winston Churchill, who congratulated her with characteristic gruffness. "You have killed more Germans than any of my generals." She smiled politely. "I just had better aim, Mr. Prime Minister." The Western press couldn't get enough of her. Newsreels showed her walking confidently through city streets, medals clinking softly. To ordinary Americans and Britons, she became the face of the Eastern Front, proof that the Soviet people were not abstract allies but flesh and blood, fighting and dying daily. To women, she was something else entirely, a new kind of hero. Strong, intelligent, and utterly fearless. The magazines printed her photographs under headlines like "The Girl Sniper of Russia" and "Lady Death Comes to America." But behind the headlines was a woman still haunted by the faces in her scope. When she looked into the cameras, she wasn't thinking about fame. She was remembering the sound of waves against the cliffs of Sevastopol and the voice of her fallen comrades. Her mission was diplomatic, but it changed the perception of the entire war. Before her arrival, many in the West had viewed the Eastern Front as a distant, grim tragedy. After she spoke, it became personal. Factories increased output. Donations surged. The cry for a second front now grew louder across the US and Britain. Historians would later say her speeches helped shift public opinion toward the eventual D-Day landings. One young factory worker wrote to her afterward, "Before you came, I thought the war was just news on the radio. Now I know who I'm working for." In November 1942, as the American tour came to a close, Lyudmila stood on the deck of a ship bound back to the Soviet Union. The ocean was calm, grey, endless. She thought of everything she had seen: skyscrapers, factories, cheering crowds, and everything she had left behind. The laughter of her friends, the smell of gunpowder, the silence of the battlefield. For the first time since the war began, she felt truly alone. She touched the small medal on her chest, the gold star of the hero of the Soviet Union, and whispered, "This doesn't belong to me. It belongs to all of them." The waves rolled on, erasing her words. But her legend was already carved into history. Winter 1943. The ship carrying Lyudmila Pavlichenko docked quietly in Murmansk, cutting through sheets of ice. No bands played. No banners fluttered. She stepped onto Soviet soil under a grey sky, her uniform stiff with salt, her medals hidden beneath her coat. The war was still raging, fiercer than ever. The Red Army had turned the tide at Stalingrad, but the cost was unimaginable. Whole cities turned to ash, millions of lives gone. Lyudmila was home, but the world she had left behind was gone. When she arrived in Moscow, she was welcomed as a national hero. Her photograph hung in shop windows. Children recited her name in school. To the nation, she was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, hero of the Soviet Union, the greatest woman sniper in history. But when she looked in the mirror, she didn't see a hero. She saw a survivor, a woman carrying the weight of 309 faces she could never forget. Her superiors greeted her warmly, but they could see the fatigue in her eyes. Her body had healed, but her mind hadn't. At the military hospital, she was offered a choice. She could rest, retire, even or serve the Red Army in a new way. Not on the front lines, but in classrooms. They needed instructors to train the next generation of snipers, and there was no one better. So she accepted. The teacher of death and survival. In a military camp outside Moscow, Lyudmila began her new duty, teaching young recruits. Most were barely out of their teens, boys who'd grown up in wartime, girls who wanted to prove they could fight. When she entered the classroom, the recruits fell silent. To them, she was a legend, a living myth wrapped in olive drab. But she didn't talk like a hero. Don't aim for glory, she told them. Aim for survival. And for the one standing beside you. Her training sessions were grueling. She taught them how to move unseen, how to judge distance by sound, how to read wind from the trembling of grass. She told them to study patience, the hardest skill of all. She would take them into the woods before dawn and make them lie still for hours, until even their breathing matched the rhythm of the earth. Sometimes she'd crawl beside a young sniper, correct their grip, whisper, "You have one shot. Make it count." Her recruits worshipped her, but she never encouraged it. She told them she wasn't brave, just prepared. Among her students were dozens of women. The Soviet Union was the only nation in the world where women fought in large numbers, especially as snipers. They came to her in awe, seeking not fame, but permission, the permission to be taken seriously. Lyudmila treated them no differently than the men. When one young woman hesitated during a training exercise, she said quietly, "The bullet doesn't care if you are a woman. Neither should you." Many of her trainees went on to the front. Some survived. Some didn't. Each loss felt personal, another name she carried in silence. Even off duty, she couldn't escape her fame. Newspapers printed her speeches. Her name was used to inspire morale. Foreign diplomats wanted to meet her, but she avoided interviews whenever possible. When reporters asked her what war was like, she answered simply, "Loud and endless." She didn't like the way people looked at her, half in admiration, half in fear. Sometimes she caught soldiers staring, as if she were not quite human. She wrote to her mother, "They call me Lady Death, but I only ever wanted to be Lyuda. I don't know if I remember how." The weight of silence. The war finally ended in May 1945. Moscow erupted in joy. Fireworks filled the night sky. People danced in the streets. Lyudmila stayed in her apartment, watching from the window. She smiled faintly, but she didn't join the crowd. Victory felt hollow. Too many names were missing. She went to Sevastopol soon after. The city she had defended was unrecognizable, a graveyard of stone and steel. She walked the ruins of her old positions, the cliffs where she and her spotter once lay side by side, rifles pointed toward the horizon. The sea was the same, calm, blue, endless. But the laughter she remembered had been replaced by silence. At the edge of the cliffs, she found the remains of an old trench. Someone had carved her initials into the rock years earlier, LMP. She touched them with her fingertips and whispered, I came back, Leonid. A single flower, wild and yellow, grew beside the mark. She left it there. Back in Moscow, life after war was complicated. She completed her university studies and became a historian, just as she had once dreamed. She wrote papers, lectured on medieval warfare, and tried to disappear into civilian life. But history, for her, was never just theory. It was memory. And memory followed her everywhere. She struggled with what modern doctors would call post-traumatic stress. She woke in the night to the echo of artillery. She kept her service pistol under her pillow for years, unable to sleep without it. Friends said she grew quieter with time, polite, gentle, but distant. She avoided military parades. She never married again after the war. When asked why, she simply said, "I already gave my heart to the front." A reunion across worlds. In 1957, an invitation arrived from an old friend, Eleanor Roosevelt. The former First Lady was visiting Moscow as part of a diplomatic tour, and she asked to see her again. 15 years had passed since they last met. Lyudmila hesitated. The idea of being photographed again made her uneasy. But she agreed. When Elena stepped into the room, she recognized her immediately. The years had softened both women, but not their eyes. Elena embraced her. "My dear Lyudmila, I've thought of you so often." Lyudmila smiled, a real warm smile, the kind that had been rare since the war. "And I of you. You were the first person who saw me not as a killer, but as a woman." They spent hours together, reminiscing, walking through gardens, speaking softly in a mix of Russian and English. They talked about peace, about the cost of it, about what it meant to survive when others did not. At one point, Elena asked, "Do you ever regret picking up that rifle?" Lyudmila was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Only that I had to." That meeting would be their last. Eleanor Roosevelt would die 5 years later. When Lyudmila heard the news, she reportedly wept for the first time in many years. In her diary, she wrote one final note about her friend. She was gentle in a world that rewarded hardness. She taught me that courage is not always loud. As the decades passed, Lyudmila remained a public figure, but a reluctant one. She worked as a researcher at the Soviet Navy headquarters, giving occasional interviews to military journals. Every May 9th, Victory Day, she would attend memorial ceremonies, placing flowers on the grave of her comrades. People would still stop her in the street. Children would stare in awe at the rows of medals on her chest. Some asked her to tell stories of war. She never did. When journalists tried to revive the myth of Lady Death, she corrected them. "I was not death. I was life, protecting life." By the 1970s, her health was failing. Old wounds ached in the cold, and years of exhaustion caught up with her. Still, she continued to visit veterans' hospitals, bringing flowers and sitting quietly beside the beds of the dying. She rarely spoke about her kills. Instead, she asked the soldiers about their families, their hopes. One nurse later said, "She had the saddest smile I've ever seen, as if she carried 1,000 ghosts with her." In the spring of 1974, Lyudmila Pavlichenko died in Moscow at the age of 58. Her funeral was attended by generals, veterans, students, and ordinary citizens. They came to say goodbye not just to a sniper, but to a symbol, the woman who had once defied every rule of war and womanhood. She was buried with full military honors in the Novodevichy cemetery, among poets, scientists, and heroes. Her gravestone is simple, her name, her rank, her years of life. No grand inscriptions, no boastful numbers. Only those who knew her story understood the silence carved into the stone. Decades later, historians would analyze her life, the statistics, the interviews, the photographs. But none of them could measure what she carried inside. A student once asked her in a lecture, "Comrade Pavlichenko, what was the hardest part of the war?" She thought for a moment. "The silence," she said. "When everything stops and you realize how much is gone." Her words lingered long after she left the war had ended. But for Lyudmila Pavlichenko, peace never truly began. Her name echoed in history books, sung in anthems, printed on posters. But fame has a strange way of erasing the human behind it. The more her story spread, the less she seemed like a person, and the more she became an idea. They called her Lady Death. They called her a hero of the Soviet Union. But few called her by her real name, Lyudmila, the daughter, the student, the woman who once just wanted to write about history, not become part of it. In post-war Soviet society, heroes were carefully sculpted. They were expected to be flawless, unbreakable symbols of courage and patriotism. But Lyudmila was not made of stone. Her wounds still hurt when the weather changed. Her nights were filled with memories she couldn't silence. She kept a photograph of a unit by her bedside, 30 young faces, only a handful of whom survived. Sometimes visitors to her apartment would find her sitting in silence, looking at that photo, tracing each face with her finger. When one journalist asked her, "What do you see when you look at that picture?" she answered quietly, "I see time. Time that stopped for them, but not for me." In the decades after the war, the Soviet Union built entire legends around its heroes. Their names were carved into granite, their faces painted in murals, their stories retold in classrooms. Children recited poems about Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the brave sniper who defeated fascism. But none of those poems spoke of what happened after the gunfire stopped. Lyudmila herself rarely corrected the record. She knew the power of myth, and she respected it. If her name inspired even one soldier to be brave, she thought, then perhaps it was worth being misunderstood. Still, she sometimes joked privately with friends. "They've made me a statue," she once said, "but statues don't feel the cold." She had become a figure too large for her own skin. When foreign dignitaries visited Moscow, she was often presented as living proof of Soviet resilience. The press called her the woman who frightened Hitler's army. She smiled politely, but inside she felt distant, as if watching herself from far away. In 1946, Lyudmila began lecturing at the Frunze Military Academy, teaching the history of sniping and battlefield tactics. She didn't just describe strategies, she told stories, small human moments that textbooks never captured. She spoke about the waiting, the cold, the hunger, the fear of blinking at the wrong time. About comrades who told jokes before missions so they wouldn't freeze from nerves. About the strange quiet that followed every shot. Her students listened in silence. Many later said she taught them more about life than about war. One cadet remembered her saying, "A sniper must learn two things, when to shoot and when not to." She paused, looking out the window. The second lesson is harder. At home, she began writing her memoirs. It wasn't an easy task. She filled notebook after notebook, crossing out entire pages, starting again. She wanted to tell the truth, but which truth? The one people wanted to hear, or the one she lived? The final version, published in 1957, was titled A Heroic Tale. It was honest in spirit, but carefully edited, like most Soviet publications of the time. Still, between the lines, readers could feel her quiet pain. She wrote, "I remember faces, not numbers. Each one had a name, a story, a laugh that is now only an echo. They say I am brave, but I was only there. Others were braver." Her book became a bestseller across the Soviet bloc, translated into multiple languages. But the parts she left unwritten, the grief, the loneliness, the guilt, stayed hidden in her private journals, which would only be discovered decades later. By the late 1950s, Lyudmila's health had begun to deteriorate. Years of stress and untreated injuries took their toll. Her face still bore faint scars from Sevastopol. Her spine ached from shrapnel fragments that surgeons had never removed. Doctors advised her to rest, but rest had never been her strength. She continued working as a historian for the Soviet Navy, cataloguing records and helping design exhibitions on the Great Patriotic War. Every year on Victory Day, she would put on her uniform, pressed, immaculate, and walk slowly among the crowds in Red Square. People would rush to shake her hand, to take photographs, to thank her. She always thanked them back. But after each parade, she went home, locked the door, and sat alone for hours in silence. In her diary, she once wrote, "They see the medals. They don't see the empty chairs." While the world remembered her for 309 confirmed kills, few remembered what those numbers meant. To her, each one was a story that ended too soon. Historians later uncovered fragments of her private letters, notes she wrote during the war but never sent. In one, addressed to her mother, she wrote, "I try not to remember the faces, but sometimes I see them before I sleep. They are young, too young, and they look surprised." She never used the word enemy, only men. In another note, she wrote, "The war teaches you strange arithmetic. You start counting the living by how many are still beside you." These letters showed a side of Lyudmila that official history rarely acknowledged, not the hardened sniper, but the human being beneath the uniform. As the years passed, Lyudmila's story began to spread beyond the Soviet Union. Writers, filmmakers, and journalists around the world became fascinated by her. In the West, she was often portrayed as the mysterious female sniper, part warrior, part legend. The truth was both simpler and more powerful. She was neither myth nor monster. She was a woman who did her duty in a time when duty meant survival. In 1946, American folk singer Woody Guthrie wrote a ballad about her, titled Miss Pavlichenko. He sang, "This is your song, Miss Pavlichenko, out of the USSR. The world will always love your name, for your deadly aim." The song turned her into a cultural bridge, the soldier who united two worlds that barely understood each other. Decades later, her friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt would be remembered as one of the rare human connections that transcended politics during the Cold War. Elena once wrote, "Lyudmila had the dignity of someone who has seen the abyss and refused to fall into it." By the time Lyudmila died in 1974, she had become both revered and forgotten. Revered by veterans and historians. Forgotten by a younger generation that knew her only as a name in a textbook. But her story didn't end with her death. In the years that followed, researchers began piecing together the full picture of her life, from the archives, her letters, and the testimonies of those she trained. They found that over 2,000 Soviet women had served as snipers during the war. Many cited Lyudmila as their inspiration. Her courage had quietly opened doors that history had long kept closed. She wasn't just fighting for her homeland. She was fighting for the right of women to stand beside men, to be seen not as symbols of weakness, but as equals in strength. One of her students later said, "She didn't tell us to be brave because we were women. She told us to be brave because we were human." Today, in museums across the world, her name appears beside the rifle she once carried, the Mosin Nagant M189130, serial number 2103. The weapon is old now, its wood darkened, the scope scratched by years of use. Beside it, a small plaque reads, "Major Lyudmila Pavlichenko, 309 confirmed kills. Hero of the Soviet Union." But that number, 309, cannot measure her ill impact. It doesn't count the soldiers she trained who lived because of her lessons. It doesn't count the women who followed her path. It doesn't count the millions who found courage in her story. Each shot she fired echoed not in the bodies it struck, but in the idea it proved. That courage knows no gender, and endurance has no nationality. In the end, Lyudmila Pavlichenko's legacy is not written in blood, but in memory. When asked once what she wanted people to remember, she said, "That I was useful. That I did my part." Simple words from a woman who had done more than almost anyone could imagine. She never glorified war. She never boasted of her record. She only asked that people remember what it took to survive, not just for her, but for everyone who stood their ground when the world collapsed. And that is perhaps her greatest victory. Not in how many she took from the world, but how many she inspired to live differently because she existed. Even after her death in 1974, Lyudmila Pavlichenko refused to fade into silence. Her story lived on, whispered in classrooms, written in history books, sung in songs, and rediscovered by generations who were not yet born when she pulled her first trigger. But time, like snow, has a way of covering footprints. And for a while, the world forgot how heavy those steps had been. In the quiet hall of the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow, there is a glass case. Inside lies her Mosin Nagant rifle, wood-worn smooth, steel darkened with age. The scope still carries a faint scratch, a scar from Sevastopol. Visitors stop and stare. Some lean close to read the plaque. Few notice the small, folded paper beside it, a fragment from her own notes. The rifle was never mine. It belonged to all who believed we could stand our ground. The case is simple, but in its reflection you can almost see her face, calm, steady, unsmiling. The face of someone who did not fight for glory, but for survival. Every May 9th, on Victory Day, crowds gather across Russia and Ukraine. Veterans in faded uniforms march slowly, medals clinking like wind chimes. Children hold portraits of their ancestors, soldiers, nurses, partisans. Among the faces, you sometimes see hers. A black and white photograph pinned to a banner, the eyes fierce and alive. Even in death, she marches beside them. In Sevastopol, a bronze statue of her now stands near the sea. The sculptor captured her not firing, not smiling, but watching. As if still guarding the cliffs she once defended. When the wind blows from the Black Sea, it passes over the rifle carved in her hands and whispers through the metal. I am still here. Lyudmila's name opened a door that could never again be closed. After the war, thousands of Soviet women received sniper training. Hundreds fought in Afghanistan and later conflicts, many citing her as their first inspiration. Modern militaries across the world now include women in elite marksmanship and reconnaissance roles, a quiet legacy of the student from Kyiv who once defied an officer's laughter. In interviews decades later, female snipers would still repeat her first lesson. Be invisible. Be patient. And when you act, let it matter. To them, she was not Lady Death. She was the teacher who made it possible to live through history rather than be erased by it. Her legend did not belong to one nation. In America, Woody Guthrie's ballad still drifts through radio archives. Miss Pavlichenko's well known to fame. Russia's your country, fighting's your game. In Ukraine, her birthplace, students learn her story not as propaganda, but as heritage, a reminder that courage is not confined to borders or flags. Historians now agree she was not simply a Soviet hero, she was a human one. A testament to what happens when conviction outweighs fear. For decades, journalists tried to label her. Propaganda called her a weapon. Western writers called her a phenomenon. Feminists called her a pioneer. But those who knew her best called her Luda. They remembered her laughter over tea, her habit of quoting poetry under her breath, the way she polished her rifle as carefully as another woman might brush her hair. They remembered how she avoided talking about killing, yet never stopped fighting for those who lived. One of her closest trainees once said, "She taught me that strength is quiet. The world makes noise when it breaks. She made silence when she stood firm." What history forgets? The world counts victories in numbers, kills, medals, campaigns. But Lyudmila's real victory was in what could not be counted. The lives she saved. The soldiers she trained who returned home. The women who followed her path and proved that courage has no uniform. In a century defined by destruction, she left behind something indestructible: example. In 1973, the year before she died, Lyudmila wrote a note in the margins of a military journal she was editing. It was never published. The paper, yellowed now, reads, "If they ever tell my story, let them say I did not want war. Let them say I was a student who loved history, who wanted to understand the world, not end it. Let them say that when the world asked too much, I did what I could." Those words, unspoken in her lifetime, have since become her epitaph, not carved in stone, but living in every retelling of her life. More than 80 years later, the sound of her rifle is long gone. But her silence remains, a silence filled not with emptiness, but with meaning. When historians speak of her now, they speak of endurance, of precision, of patience, but also of empathy, of conscience, of the unbreakable will of a woman who refused to look away. Lyudmila Pavlichenko reminds us that war is not about heroes or numbers. It is about choices, what we protect, what we sacrifice, and what we become afterward. She made her choice in 1941 when she stepped into a recruitment office and refused to be dismissed. The world has been echoing with that choice ever since. Soft orchestral fade, archival photos cross-fading on screen, her in uniform, her smiling beside Eleanor Roosevelt, her statue by the sea. She never asked to be remembered, but history remembers her anyway. Not as Lady Death, but as Lady Courage. A girl with a rifle who changed what courage looked like. Dedicated to Lyudmila Pavlichenko, 1916-1974. And to every woman who refused to stand aside.